Hello. This is a video presentation on the Chinese initials. The contents of this video presentation are supplementary to the foundation work text. This does not replace the texts or classroom lectures in this course. The aim of this video presentation is to make clear to you the systematic organization of the sounds of modern Standard Chinese. As you may know, each syllable in Chinese consists of three parts: the tone, the initial, and the final. I'm assuming at this time that you have learned the tones. In the next few minutes, I will discuss the initials, and at another time, I will introduce the finals. The main point of reference in this video presentation is the table of initials, a copy of which may be available to you. In any case, I have written out the table of initials on the blackboard here, and I will be referring to it frequently. The table is constructed by rows and columns. The columns describe the method of articulating sounds, and each column has a name. There are 5 columns. The rows describe the place in the mouth where the sound is produced by movement of the tongue, the lips, and other parts of the mouth. And each of these names in the 6 rows designates a particular configuration of the oral cavity when producing the sounds. My underlying belief in making this presentation is that many, perhaps most, adult learners will find it easier to learn Chinese pronunciation if they also understand intellectually the systematic structure of this chart. One of your assignments in this segment of the course will be to learn the table of initials and the table of finals so thoroughly and so well that you can write them out or recite them aloud from memory. I hope that what follows below will assist you to do that with greater understanding. Before getting into the sound system, it's desirable to say something first about the writing system that we use. As you may know, the Chinese written characters, which have been used for several thousand years, are not really a phonetic form of writing. And it has only been within the last 100 years that purely phonetic writing has become widely used to write the sounds of the Chinese language. Several major forms of phonetic script have been used for Chinese in the 20th century. About 1920, a set of so-called Chinese phonetic symbols was invented in China. This is often popularly called bo, po, mo, fo, which are the first 4 elements or characters in that system of sounds. The Chinese phonetic symbols are still recognized by many older people in mainland China. They are not an alphabetic kind of writing. These symbols are also taught in schools both in Taiwan and in other Chinese-speaking communities outside mainland China. A second major trend in the phonetic writing of Chinese has been what we call romanization. This word refers to using the letters of the Roman alphabet, which is essentially the English alphabet, to write the sounds of Chinese. There have been several different widely used romanizations of Chinese. In English-speaking countries, a system known as the Wade-Giles romanization has been widely used for most of this century. The name of this romanization comes from the names of the 2 English scholars, Thomas Wade and Herbert Giles, who developed it about a century ago. Those of you who do much reading about Chinese history and literature, or politics and society, will probably need to read and pronounce the Wade-Giles romanization correctly, even if you never need to write it. In the 1950s, a new system of romanization was officially adopted in mainland China. it is called Hanyu Pinyin. Hanyu means Chinese language. Pinyin means spelling. This system of romanization is often called just Pinyin for short. In this course, we will use the Pinyin romanization, but we recognize also that in future many of you, particularly concentrators in East Asian studies, will also have need to read accurately, if not also to write, the Bopomofo Chinese phonetic alphabet, or the Wade-Giles romanization. Therefore, and here's the main point today, if you learn the underlying structure of the Mandarin sound system through Pinyin, as I hope you will do in these two video presentations, it will then be easier to learn any other phonetic writing system for Chinese. Here on the blackboard is the table of initials. Within a few days, you should be able to write out from memory the portion of this chart which contains the letters of the alphabet. Within this area here. In Chinese schools where the Bopomofo Chinese phonetic script is taught, students memorize the symbols in a fixed sequence, just as students who learn the English alphabet normally recite that in a sequence from A to Z. Those of you who may have learned the Bopomofo system earlier should note carefully that the rows in this table of initials on the board here are arranged in a slightly different sequence than you have previously learned. This change in the sequence does not affect pronunciation, and it should not cause any difficulty in learning. In addition to memorizing the sequence of letters inside the double lines, there are no double lines in this chart. In addition to memorizing the sequence of letters in the rows and columns of this chart, it will also be useful to take note of the somewhat technical terminology used at the top and on the left side of this table. Each row of initials is pronounced by using a different part of the mouth to form the sound, by opening or closing the lips, or by moving the tongue to touch different parts of the oral cavity. The speaker forms sound chambers of different shapes. Each shape produces a distinctive sound. The initials in Chinese resemble consonants in English in that they can be written in isolation, but they are normally pronounced by adding a vowel sound. In English, we write the letter B alone, but we habitually pronounce it with an accompanying vowel sound, as if it were spelled B-E or B-E-E. Likewise, we write the letter K alone, but say it automatically with a different vowel, as if it were written like the name K-A-Y. The letter R in English is preceded by yet another vowel when pronounced, as if it were spelled A-R-E. So too the letter L is said as if it were written E-L. Likewise, in the special context of this table of initials, the Chinese initials are written in isolation, each without a vowel. However, when recited aloud as a series of initials in sequence, each row is customarily pronounced together with the sound of a particular vowel, which is indicated here to the left of each row of the table. The vowel chosen for each row is one which seems naturally to follow the sound of that type of initial. Let's now study and practice the rows of initials from left to right using the appropriate vowel for each row. First, labials. B, P, M, and F are the letters that we use. The word labial refers to the lips, and these initials are the only ones formed by closed or nearly closed lips. As the lips open, an accompanying vowel sound is formed, which is represented on the table by the letter O. Note that this sound is very different from the English vowel sound commonly represented by the letter O, which ends with the lips rounded and protruded forward. For example, the English O, 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 go, throw. You can see that my lips are protruded forward and rounded at the end. On the contrary, the Chinese sound, represented by this letter O, ends with its lips relaxed and not rounded. I will say more on this subject in the next video presentation on finals. For the moment, just listen carefully and try to imitate the sound directly without relying on a verbal description of it. Now, practice with me. There is a subtle difference between bo and po, which I will discuss after we have read through all the rows. For now, just see if you can hear and imitate the difference. To review once more this row. Bo, po, mo, fo. Now say the entire row with me. Bo, po, mo, fo. Repeat, please. Good. The second row is the dental row. Obviously, this implies that these sounds are formed with the teeth. The letters are D, T, N, and L. These initials are formed by placing the tip of the tongue just behind the upper front teeth, resting against the place where the teeth emerge from their sockets. This position is slightly forward of the usual position for similar sounds in English. The vowel used with this row of initials is written with the English letter E, although it sounds very different from the English E. This vowel is pronounced by relaxing the back of the throat, relaxing the back of the tongue, I should say, so that the throat opens as if one were gargling, so to speak. Again, just try to imitate this sound directly for now. We will study it in more detail in the video on finals. Now let's practice pronouncing the dental initials in sequence. D, K, N, L. Once more. D, K, N, L, and D, K, N, L. After me. Good. Again, please note there is a subtle difference between the first two elements in this row, and I will discuss this further below. The third row is named dental sibilants, and the word sibilant means hissing. The common feature of the three initials in this row is a buzzing or hissing sound. The letters used are Z, C, and S. The initial Z is in effect a compound of the dental initial D with the sound of the letter S. Hence, it is a dental plus the hissing sound. The Z resembles closely the letters DS in the English word reads. However, there is one important difference which will be pointed out below. Likewise, the initial C is in effect a compound of the dental initial T with the letter S. So the sound of this Chinese initial, represented by the letter C, is very similar to the letters TS in the English word its. Its. And there is a slight difference from the English, which will be discussed again further below. The third dental sibilant is simply S alone. And in this case, the tongue almost touches the back of the front teeth. S, s. Note particularly that the vowel sound used with this row of initials is what we call a vocalized extension of the preceding consonant. In this case, it amounts to a buzzing continuation of the final. A buzzing continuation of the initial. Pronounce this whole sound by placing the tongue in the appropriate position for the initial. Then simply vibrate the vocal cords with minimal movement of the tongue tip and no opening of the throat. In other words, you place your tongue in the correct position for forming this sound, this what is like a D plus S. You hold your tongue in your throat there without moving them, and then you simply rumble the vocal cords. This is an unfamiliar sound to native speakers of English, and it is temporarily represented in this stage of your study by a new symbol, the crossed letter I. Note carefully the subtle but very crucial difference between the sound of the letter E, used above with the dentals, where the throat opens, and the sound of this crossed I used with dental sibilants, where the throat does not open. This sound cannot be produced in isolation by itself. It is simply nothing more than a vocal continuation of the preceding consonant. It has no independent use by itself. So it must be pronounced with these letters. For example, ZI with this crossed I will be Z, Z. CI is C, C. SI will be S, S. Once more then. Z, Z, S. And the whole row together. Z, Z, S. Z, Z, S. As with the labial and dental rows above, there is a subtle difference between the first two initials in this row, which I will discuss near the end of this presentation. The fourth row is called retroflexes. These are written by the letters ZH for the first element, CH for the second element, SH for the third element, and R. Retro means reverse. Flex means to bend. So the common quality of the retroflex initials is that they are pronounced by bending the tip of the tongue upward and slightly backward. In the case of ZH and CH, the tip of the tongue touches the roof of the mouth, which is called the palate, then quickly moves slightly away. This contact with the palate gives the first two initials a common quality which is different from the SH and the R, where the tongue approaches but does not quite touch the palate. In R, there is also a slight buzzing sound, somewhat like the first letter in the French pronoun je. Je. In English, the letters CH, SH, and R may also stand at the front of a word, but there is a critical difference between those English sounds and the Chinese retroflex initials. The English sounds are regularly pronounced with the lips rounded or protruded. For example, in the word chair, show, chair, show. You can see that as I start to form the initial sounds in those words, my lips become rounded and pushed forward. In Chinese, however, that is not the case. The lips are relaxed and not extended forward. Therefore, when practicing the retroflex initials in this video presentation, we will emphasize saying them with the lips relaxed, since that is the common practice in Chinese. As with the dental sibilant row above, retroflex initials are also pronounced by a vocalized extension of the initial consonant. In this case, the vocalized extension amounts to a strong, continuing overtone of the sound of the letter R. This R sound is produced by placing the tongue in the retroflex position and then simply vibrating the vocal cords with only very minimal movement of the tongue and no movement of the lips. The throat is not opened. Thus, for example, the initial SH sounds like the SHR in the English word shrill. But of course, as I said a moment ago, in English, the lips are rounded when you start to say that, and in Chinese they are relaxed. The distinctive vocalization in SH is temporarily represented in this stage of your study by the letter I with a subscript R. The distinctive vocalization for all of these retroflex initials is indicated by a subscript R following this letter I. To review briefly, the dental sibilants and the retroflexes, these two rows, are both pronounced by simply vibrating the vocal cords with little or no movement of the tongue and the lips, and the throat is left unopened. The letter I, used with these two rows, indicates a common trait which both rows share, namely closing of the throat during the extended vocalizing of the consonant. On the other hand, the difference between these two types of initials is indicated at this stage of study by crossing the letter I for dental sibilants and by writing a subscript for the retroflexes. Note especially that the closure of the throat during both of these vocalizations in the dental sibilant and retroflex rows, indicated by the letter I, is in contrast to the more open position of the throat, which is used to produce the vowel written as the letter E after dental initials in the second row. So the I here has common qualities as well as different traits. But the I, in any case, indicates a kind of closed throat in contrast to the more open throat of the E. Correctly distinguishing between dental sibilants and retroflexes relies entirely on the position of the tip of the tongue. In dental sibilants, the tongue's contact point is next to the front teeth. Z, ts, s. In retroflexes, the tongue's tip curls back to the palate, which is some distance behind the teeth. Zh, ch, sh. It's only by curling the tongue back that you can achieve and produce the characteristic overtone of the sound of the letter R here in the retroflex rows. The distinction between the dental sibilants and the retroflexes, based on the position of the tongue tip, is a primary characteristic of standard pronunciation of Chinese. And confusion between these two rows of initials is a trait typical of Mandarin spoken in southern regions of China. Now, practice pronouncing the series of retroflex initials with me. Zh, ch, sh, zh, Note that, as in the 3 rows of initials above, there is a subtle but important difference between the first 2 members of this row, which we will discuss further below. The 5th row is called palatals. The palate is the roof of the mouth. Initials in this row are formed by raising the middle section of the tongue's upper surface to approach or contact the palate, and the tip of the tongue is relaxed. This is exactly the opposite to the curled position of the tongue tip in the retroflex row, where the tip is raised, but the upper surface of the tongue is not raised in the retroflexes. Therefore, the contrast between retroflexes and palatals is somewhat subtle, because it depends simply on which part of the tongue touches the palate. The sounds in these 2 rows each somewhat resemble English sounds. However, the position of the tongue tip in English is intermediate between the tongue tip position used in these 2. However, hearing and speaking the difference between these 2 rows is absolutely crucial for effective communication in Chinese. And students with limited previous exposure to this language will need to concentrate very heavily on learning and practicing this distinction. The 2nd and 3rd members of this row, written Q and X, may be described as follows. The initial Q resembles somewhat, but not exactly, the letters CH in English. And the initial X resembles somewhat, but not exactly, the letters SH in English. However, there is a particular condition that applies to these 2 initials, and it also applies to the initial J, which is different from the English J. And that condition is the tip of the tongue in this row, J, Q, and X, plays a much less active role than it does in the corresponding English sounds. To help articulate the correct pronunciation of palatals and to assist in distinguishing palatals from retroflexes, it's very useful to remember one fact. Palatals are always followed by a sound like the first vowel in the English word even. But retroflexes are never followed by that sound. Even. E. This vowel is produced by raising the middle part of the tongue, a movement which also distinguishes the palatals from the retroflexes and also distinguishes the palatals from the dental sibilants. E. We write this sound with the simple, unmodified letter I. The same letter I, whether modified or not, is used with 3 different rows in this table: the dental sibilants, the retroflexes, and the palatals, because the vowels associated here with all of those initials are all pronounced without opening the throat. These vowels then, in these 3 rows, are contrasted with the open-throated vowels O and E, used in the other rows of this table. Now, pronounce with me the palatal initials in sequence. Ji, ji. The middle part of your tongue is touching the palate. The tip is relaxed and not making contact with the top of the mouth. Qi, qi. Shi, shi. Once more. Ji, qi, shi. As with the 4 rows above, one further distinction remains to be made about the first 2 initials in this row, and I will say more about that below. Finally now, the 6th row and the last one, the gutturals. The name of this row refers to the Latin word which means throat, indicating that these initials are all produced by movement of the rear of the tongue near the soft palate at the back of the mouth. The first two of these initials, G, written G, and K, are not difficult for English speakers to pronounce, although the third one, H, is closer to the letter CH in the German word ach than to the English H. Guttural initials are conventionally pronounced in this table with the open-throated sound used for the dental row above, represented by the letter E. Now, pronounce with me the guttural initials in sequence. G, K, H. Once more. G, K, H. In what follows immediately below, I will clarify the difference common to all 6 rows of initials between the first and second members of each row. You've now been introduced to the 6 rows of initials. Let us next consider the vertical structure of this table of initials. The 3 columns at the right of the table, nasals, fricatives, and voiced continuants, do not present any particular difficulties for English speakers, so I will concentrate on the 2 columns at the left, unaspirated stops and aspirated stops, because these are somewhat different from English, and the distinction between them is crucially important. These 2 columns contain initials which are called stops. A stop is called a stop because during the pronunciation of these consonants, there is a moment when the breath passage is completely closed. This blockage of the breath may occur by the action of the lips, the tongue, or the throat, depending on the place where the sound is articulated. When the blockage of breath is removed, the flow of breath typically resumes, but there are 2 different ways that it may resume, and these ways of resuming the flow of breath are subtly but crucially different, and they are represented by the 2 different columns of stops. The 2 columns of stops are distinguished only by one thing. There's only one difference between these 2 columns of stops, and that is either they have what we call aspiration or they don't have aspiration. Aspiration means a vigorous explosion of breath. Aspiration or its absence is often the only point of distinction between 2 entirely different words in the Chinese language. Therefore, effective communication in Chinese depends very, very much on accurately hearing and articulating in speech the aspiration. The beginning student needs often to overcome an unconscious resistance to making such a sharp explosion of breath as native speakers frequently do, even when they speak without any special emphasis. Let us now begin by reading from top to bottom the column of aspirated initials, the second column, remembering to make a particularly vigorous explosion of breath with each one. Po, T, C, Ch, Qi, K. Remember, the only difference between the 2 columns of stops is the presence, in this case, or the absence, in this case, of the aspiration. Therefore, after practicing the aspirated stops, it only remains to remove entirely the aspiration in order then to be naturally pronouncing the unaspirated twins. For this reason, it's useful to practice the distinction between these 2 columns of initials by pronouncing them in pairs while holding a light piece of paper flat against one's face. First pronounce the aspirated member of the pair and then the unaspirated one. The force of breath should visibly move the paper in the first case, but the paper must not move at all when the aspiration is removed. And I will now give you a demonstration of this effect. Po, te, ci, chi, qi, ke, bo, de, zi, zhi, ji, ge. So you can see, I think, there very clearly, and perhaps somewhat amusingly, the strong contrast between these two columns of sounds. And the only difference between them is the difference produced by the explosion of breath in the first case. Let us now prepare to practice pronouncing the two columns of stops in pairs, beginning in each case with the aspirated one. Remember that in each pair it's only necessary to remove the aspiration from the first member in order then naturally to be pronouncing the second one accurately. When you come to say the unaspirated initials, do not think in your mind's eye of the letters in the first column, because those will distract you. Rather, merely listen to the sound of the aspirated initial as you have just pronounced it, and repeat it again, but with the mildest possible release of breath. Now let's practice them in pairs. Po, bo, te, de, ci, zi, chi, zhi, qi, ji, ke, ge. You are now able, or you should be able, to pronounce these initials accurately. That is, both columns, in particular the first column, using the method described just above. And to repeat that method is, say these, the second column first, and say them with a strong aspiration. Then simply remove the aspiration, give only the mildest possible release of breath, and you will automatically and naturally have produced the first column. Now, why do I tell you not to look at this stage when you're first learning these unaspirated stops? Why do I tell you to concentrate on the second column and not look at the first column? The point that remains to be made about both columns of stops is that they are all of them unvoiced. That is, the vocal cords do not vibrate during the moment when the initial is formed. In this respect, the initials of the first column are different from the corresponding initial consonants in English. For example, say the words bear, boy, Berlin, Boston. These all have voiced labial initials, characteristic of English. If you observe closely, you will probably feel vibration of the vocal cords during the moment when you pronounce the initial B in the English word, just before the beginning of the vowel. You may also observe the same quality in the dental initials in English, beginning with the letter D, such as Denver, dusty, dog, danger. And likewise in the palatal of the English word J-E-E-P, Jeep, Jeep. The J is voiced. And in the guttural words, goat, gun, give, and get, that is the guttural initials which begin those words, you'll also notice voicing in English. Now, it's very probable, I think, that you've never really noticed this voicing in the English consonants initials. And you may now find it hard to imagine yourself saying directly an initial B, D, J, or G without voicing it. That is, it may not seem natural to you or easy to know how to remove that voicing directly from these sounds. But however, this is what you will need to be able to do to speak Chinese without a foreign accent. Therefore, as we have done above, I believe the easy way for English speakers to learn the first column of initials accurately is simply to begin with the second column, in which the English letters do not have voicing, and then simply remove the strong aspiration from each of the corresponding members in order to produce the unaspirated column of stops. I think the point must be clear by now. As supplement to the above, for the benefit of any of you who know French, it may be useful to note that French has unvoiced, aspirated initials like Chinese and unlike English. For example, the letter P in pourquoi is like the English initial, is like the Chinese initial written with the letter B. Bo. The letter T in the French toujours is like the Chinese initial de, and the C in carte is like the Chinese initial written with the letter G. Ge. Although these sounds are not found as initials in English, these sounds in English may follow an initial letter S. For example, in the English word spout, the P is like the Chinese initial bo. In the English word steam, the letter T resembles the Chinese initial de, de, and the K in the English word skull resembles, it's identical with the Chinese initial ge. However, note that the DS in the English word reads, R-E-A-D-S, reads, is voiced, and therefore it's unlike the Chinese initial Z. Z. So, in order to learn to produce this sound, you cannot work from a comparison in English. You must rely on the method described above of removing aspiration from the second column. This C resembles TS in English. It's said with a strong aspiration in this column and with the aspiration removed in this column. This is the end now of the video presentation on the table of initials.